Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by the brilliant Dr. Kaye Monk-Morgan, President and CEO of the Kansas Leadership Center. Kaye is a powerhouse in civic leadership and adaptive leadership, bringing decades of experience in mobilising communities and developing leaders across the globe. Together, we explore the real meaning of leadership, not as a position, but as an activity anyone can take up. Kaye shares what it looks like to build teams that thrive, even in uncertainty, how to create alignment in complex systems, and how to make leadership less risky for everyone. This conversation is warm, wise, and full of practical insights to help you lead more intentionally. Whether you're guiding a team, navigating adaptive challenges, or working towards greater impact, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kaye Monk-Morgan. She's the President and CEO of the Kansas Leadership Center. The center is responsible for civic leadership and engagement and is a non-for-profit. Kaye holds a doctorate in educational leadership and has over 30 years of industry experience. I was lucky enough to be a participant with Kaye at the Art and Practice of Leadership Development at the Harvard Kennedy School last year. And when I was thinking of who to interview, I instantly thought of Kaye as someone who brings a really practical lens to complex adaptive leadership challenges. So welcome, Kaye.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so good to see you, Claire.
It's so good to see you too. Tell us a little bit more about what you do at the Kansas Leadership Center, a bit about your role and the types of things you do there.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here with you and to talk to you and your listeners and folks that are engaged in your community. The Kansas Leadership Center is an organization that's about 17, almost 18 years old, created to help everyday Kansans engage in community in different ways around adaptive issues. And so we have a plethora of services. We provide leadership development and training for about 5,000 folks all over the globe annually. Some of that physically in our location here in Wichita, Kansas, and a lot of that virtually for folks all over. We provide civic facilitation for communities that are centering adaptive challenges and they need to bring folks together around diagnosis. We publish a magazine. We have a research arm that looks into all types of phenomena related to adaptive leadership and leadership in general. And we provide coaching as well. And so we have an enterprise that is heavily engaged in lots of different buckets. My role really is to support innovation as a person with authority in our system to ensure that we're meeting as many needs as we possibly can with the resource we have available.
Awesome. Sounds like you do a lot. Last week, I was at the Australian Adaptive Leadership Institute Learning Lab, and quite a few people had either, been to the Harvard course we'd been to, but a lot of people talked about the KLC program and how that got so much benefit. So it's definitely on my radar to do one of the KLC programs because they do get held in very high regard, that's for sure.
We'd love to have you.
Yeah. Awesome. So you used the word authority before in terms of your position. So KLC and also, I guess, the Adaptive Leadership Framework by Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz talks about leadership being an activity and not a position. Tell us a little bit more about what that actually means.
Yeah, for us, it means that we have an expectation and we know that civic issues or adaptive issues have to be addressed from people all up and down a hierarchical structure and across industries. And so we believe that anyone can lead and that they can do that anytime and anywhere. It's not reserved for people with title and position. And so in our lexicon, we differentiate who the leader is because the expectation is that we're all exercising leadership from our position within our organization. and what authority is. And authority oftentimes is a person who is in charge in a more traditional sense.
Yeah. Excellent. So you talk about civic leadership and adaptive leadership, and I feel like they go hand in hand. So what is it? What are some examples of what like the civic leadership situations that many of your participants are exploring, or the adaptive challenges that they're exploring? What does that actually look like?
Yeah, you know what? I appreciate the question. We recently here in the city of Wichita, our local municipality is dealing with a parking issue.
Yeah.
Parking seems rather benign until you start taking people's parking spaces and making them pay. And so we were engaged to help them in listening sessions around what does community parking look like. We define civic as anything that's for the common good. And so it can be anything as it can be parking. We do a lot of work with folks that are in elected or public office who in our hope is are looking for supporting the common good or the public good. So any of those, we did some work with city planning about parks and rec, and we do a lot of work around homelessness, or if there is an issue that is showing up in a community where that community has determined that they want to come together to make progress on it, and it meets it, and there's a collective purpose or a collective need, we define that as civic.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. So when we think about leadership, like how do you define leadership? And I've got what we call the green book. Everyone talks about the green book by Marley and Amanda. How do you define leadership, both at KLC, but for yourself?
Yeah, well, KLC, we use the language that leadership is about mobilizing people to make progress on really tough issues. I jokingly say, if you're walking down the street and you think you're the leader and you turn around and nobody's following you, you're not the leader. It's about getting other people engaged toward a common purpose, maybe not from the same stance or with the same point of view, but everybody's doing what they can to make progress on a tough challenge. I think leadership really is showing up and doing your best to contribute. We talk about leadership and followership. I think leadership can be found within followership if you are engaging others, if you're asking powerful questions. So you don't have to be the person with the title or the name or standing in front of the room to be a person of consequence as it relates to one of these really big issues.
Because you talk about like mobilizing people, and I know the concept in adaptive leadership is about giving the work back. So what are some of the barriers, specifically with teams, when everybody leaves? And how can we overcome some of those barriers? Because it's all well and good to give the work back, but what's the challenge when everybody leaves?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, Claire, is differentiating between technical and adaptive work. And this notion that oftentimes the giving the work back in an adaptive situation really is how do we bring people together around collective purpose? And what does it look like to even have a collective premise that we're all going to do this thing or impact this particular issue? In more technical work, it really is a place for strong authority and for authority to be much more engaged in protection, direction, and order in a space of creating opportunities for folks to engage around not necessarily tough, daunting issues, but things that everybody's company deals with. In our lexicon, our invitation for everyone to exercise leadership does not mean everybody gets to be the boss. It does mean that everyone can see and seize a moment to engage around an issue that they care about from their point of view and can help move that forward. And so we try to differentiate between who are the decision-making authorities. We talk a little about who's accountable for decisions and who's responsible for decisions. I read in one of your blogs about accountability just this week. We're not afraid of accountability. We think leadership comes with being accountable for both your actions and in some cases the outcomes. So I think one of the things that makes us hard is just not understanding and differentiating things properly.
Yeah. I might pick up on the point of accountability because it's something I'm particularly passionate about. And, I often say that it's a bit of a dirty word because people kind of feel like it's about blame or micromanagement or finger pointing. And what I think is really interesting in the context of what you're talking about giving the work back is that we individually have our accountability of what we're accountable for, that psychological ownership. But then there's the shared accountability that happens between team members within a team. And then there's also collective accountability that happens between stakeholders. And when I think about technical challenges for listeners, technical challenges are problems that we've solved before and we can draw on our past experience, and they often have a fix to them. They're solvable. Whereas an adaptive challenge, we're learning our way forward. We're going into uncharted territory. And I do think that for technical challenges, individual accountability and collective accountability is required. But I do think for adaptive challenges, you need all three things. You need individually to feel accountable to make progress on that challenge. You need to work together within a team and can rely on each other. But then it's more systemic. And I think it's the system about giving the work back. So what's your view around, I guess, collective accountability within organizations and between organizations?
Yeah, we do a lot of that. We call it partnership, right? And that's our invitation for folks for collective accountability, that we want to partner with organizations that are working on tough things. I think it shows up in, when we're identifying who is doing the work, right? Once we've accomplished that particular task, doing it and holding true to whatever promises that have been made, and understanding, really level setting what the learning threshold is. We talk a lot here and with our partners and even our partners in learning around risk, and accountability comes with risk. If I am the person with authority in my system and I relinquish that authority in order to make progress on something that's adaptive, so we're doing the work differently, we're showing up in space differently, I'm still going to be accountable to my board of directors on whether or not that outcome comes to pass. And so I think making sure that people understand what it means to be accountable, both for their own selves and to the larger kind of corporate entity and to the goal that we've agreed on, that requires folks having a voice and a vote to the degree possible on what those goals are. It's hard for me to feel like I'm accountable to goals that I didn't have a voice or a vote in. And so there's an invitation to folks to show up in that space that way.
Yeah. Having a bit more skin in the game. I do think people have a lot more buy-in when they've had a voice and been heard. And I think that's when people get frustrated with accountability, when it feels like it's been lumped on them. So how do you kind of get the voices in the room that need to be there, which sometimes is easier said than done. So you mentioned the fact that adaptive leadership is risky. I think it can be risky work, and it does involve uncertainty and us taking risks. How can leaders mobilize teams to do the risky work? Because I guess, when I think about applying some of what we learned at Harvard in the context, sometimes people's jobs are on the line and that feels really risky. So how can leaders mobilize people to do the risky work?
Yeah, I think the folks who have power or authority in systems, part of their job is to reduce the risk when possible and to mitigate risk as best we can. We don't ask people to engage in things that are so risky that they're going to lose their jobs. We're asking them to play on kind of like the green book, on your edge. What takes you out of your comfort zone just a little bit? So we try to get people to recognize what the risk is. One of the things that we recognize, and we talked about this in our coursework as well, is that oftentimes the greatest risk is fear. It comes with fear of loss. Oftentimes the risk is, I fear, particularly from the boss, right? I fear if my people are exercising leadership and they don't need me, then maybe I won't be the expert anymore. Or maybe that the team will move forward without me in a way that diminishes my role here or my authority in a way. And so I think for folks who have authority in systems, that idea of making leadership less risky is being clear about creating pathways for folks to experiment and letting folks know, this ties to accountability. This is how far you can run before I need you to pull back. Or creating the safe boundaries. I talked to our folks a little bit about bowling. And in the US, you can go bowling and they have these little bumpers that you can put up.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Help your ball go faster, right? My job, to the degree it can be, is to make sure that my people have bumpers. They're not going to go off the rails. My job is to stay on the rails to keep them straight. and let things go as far as they possibly can. But I think we have to be really clear in articulating what's off the table and what's on the table
Yeah.
within within systems.
Yeah. And I guess that's where the complexity of the adaptive challenges come, because I feel like there's such a big link between taking risks and failing, but doing it in a way that's safe. So people that are experimenting and learning, and it really kind of links to this learning culture that happens within the team. So, like thinking about adaptive leadership challenges and the fact that they kind of require evolution and learning, how do teams best learn effectively? Like you've talked about experimenting. What else can teams do to create that learning culture within a team?
I think we lean in on creating trustworthy processes. We had a group of college students here in the building today in a program called Leadership and Free Expression, in an effort to help students across the state of Kansas both exercise their free right speech, their right of free speech, and to do so in such a way that it represents nuance, and they're able to help make progress on the things that they care about, particularly in the role of civil disobedience. So we talked a lot about, what does it look like to create a trustworthy process? Oftentimes, we may or may not trust the individual people who are involved in systems, particularly if those are closed systems. But we do need to own the opportunity to create a process where there is some trust. Whether or not that's asking really good questions is a place to do that, to be clear about individual roles, to set standards and expectations around accountability. If those things are documented and clearly discussed on the front end, it makes for a space where I know what the benefit of risk is for our organization. And I also know what I have to lose. And being clear about that, I think, is one of the ways that teams and folks who are working in teams can really make some progress there.
Yeah. So we're hearing like the curiosity, expectation setting of what's the parameters within which they can work so that they can kind of then test in those boundaries. You mentioned closed systems. What do you mean by closed systems?
Yeah, we think about closed systems as being systems like an inner office or a team that's working within the constraints of an organization, opposed to an open system if we're working on poverty. Now, we're working on poverty from my office setting through our community engagement initiative, then that might be a closed system. It's just us, the folks that are in it. We know who they are. We know what resources are available. We know what the rules of engagement are. In an open system, we may be calling the entire city to come together to work on homelessness. That's an open system. There aren't the same carrots and or sticks or shared language or values in those systems. So it's every man's game, and sometimes it requires a slightly different set of rules.
Yeah. And I feel like and maybe it is an open system that I'm thinking of. I feel like there's organizations that sort of sit in between. They have such dependencies on, even think about like healthcare or something, that they're dependent on ministers and government and other societies and et cetera to be successful as well. And that stakeholder alignment is so critical for their success too within an organization. So thinking about that in the context of alignment, so how do teams ensure, first of all, that there's alignment within teams? So probably that closed system, alignment with team members, but also, if it's a closed system with stakeholders internally, but also external stakeholders. Is there any recommendations based on the adaptive work you do about gaining alignment with stakeholders, whether they're internal stakeholders or kind of external?
I think it's all about collective purpose and being really intentional about sharing what the work is and why we do the work. What I find, whether it's internal or externally groups, folks show up to a cause with a different purpose. I may care about homelessness as a citizen. Someone else may care as a person who was formerly unhomed. Someone else may care as an elected official. So owning the positionality and why you show up, that faction, right? If you take the stakeholders and the factions and lay those things together, I think that's one way to help alleviate some discomfort by being really clear. The other thing I think is we talk about being vulnerable, both as individuals and understanding our vulnerabilities as a person who's showing up, trying to exercise leadership. If we can create systems where we're speaking truth and we know one another's heart. Again, if we trust the process, I don't have to trust you, but if we build a process that is transparent enough that I can trust you and I hear you from your heart to my heart, that makes it a little bit easier in our team to make progress on some stuff. There are things that I will let go of and be like, oh, I'm not I'm not going to fight about because the greater good is this. And if we're fighting for the greater good and we're aligned together on that, sometimes that buys us a little bit of time and road to make progress on something.
What I find happens a lot, especially with leadership teams, when we do look at stakeholders, is we often operate on assumed knowledge of what other views or beliefs or loyalties that the factions or stakeholders might have, rather than getting the voices in the room. Do you have any tips about like how we can stop operating on assumed knowledge and actually either get the voices in the room themselves or create connections with those partners?
Yeah, I think it's a matter, oftentimes, if you ask, people are really excited about sharing
Yeah.
their view. I rarely come across a person that isn't willing to say why they showed up for a particular event. I think it's one of the most genuine ways to invite people into partnership.
Yeah.
It's just, we hosted a group of community leadership partner programs in the building over the last 2 days. And at their kickoff, I literally spent an hour saying, this is what KLC is up to. Here are our priorities for 2025. Here's our growth trajectory. This is how you help us meet our goals. This is how we think we help you meet your goals. And I probably had 5 people come up to me and say, I really appreciated the invitation kind of behind the curtain as to what it is that you all are doing. And your invitation to partner feels different now that I know what we're partnering on.
Yeah.
Before, I was a recipient of what it is that you were giving. Now we're partners in doing the work.
Yeah. Creates that, like goes back to the collective purpose you spoke about before, because often we can say, these are our priorities, this is what we're doing, but even just using the collective language of, so people can see how they fit into, I want to say the mess, but how they fit into the priorities or what's actually happening, so they can see how they actually play a role in having that partnership. I think it's so critical. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when you're on teams, everybody wants to know that their work is going to matter. The effort that they expend on behalf of whatever the goal is going to be valued by the team. So being able to identify, this is what your work allows this group to do. This is why you are part of this group. This is what you bring to the table. People want to be seen and heard. And I think really important piece of making leadership less risky.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is like doing that within a team, between teams, and with your stakeholders and partners is really important, kind of talking about the collective work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we bring it back to the team itself, whether it's a team within an organisation, a leadership team, and when we're in, going through an adaptive leadership challenge, there's often uncertainty, but we need to create an environment where people take risks and we have that healthy, challenging debate. Do you have any tips or techniques to help people feel comfortable having that healthy, challenging debate and taking more risks?
Yeah. One of the things that I try to do, again, as a person with authority in this system, but I don't have authority in every system, is to set the groundwork of, we're going to name that this is going to be difficult. We're going to name that we probably aren't all going to come down on this issue in the same space, that there's going to be some challenge there, and invite challenge. Oftentimes, I think people are unwilling or uncomfortable engaging in difficult dialogue because the invitation hasn't been laid. We think people know that they have the right and responsibility of showing up that way, but sometimes people need to be explicitly invited there. And then I think the other thing is coaching people. I've heard people who work in the adaptive space say things like, I challenged authority. That to me feels very risky. You may not want to challenge authority, but you probably should be challenging ideas.
Yeah.
You should be challenging the status quo. There are a lot of things, and our language matters. I think when folks come and say, I read what you wrote and I have a different take on that particular idea, that's not challenging my authority. It's challenging the idea, and the idea may be a half-baked one. Kudos to helping me refine that or replace it with something that's better. So part of it, I think, is being approachable and inviting people to have honest discussion. And I think the other part is coaching people to be able to have the language to have difficult conversations without it being controversial or conflictual. We can have a deep discussion where we disagree without being angry, and helping people into that space, I think, is the biggest work.
Yeah. I mean, we want teams to disagree because that's where we know that innovation happens. If we all have groupthink, we're not going to innovate because we all think the same. So I think it's so important to have to know that disagreeing is a good thing, and it's about them being aligned with what we decide. And I think that's what's really important. You're making me think of this morning. I read a post by David Clutterbuck, who's also been a podcast guest, and it said, "Don't coach the client, coach the system." And I think it goes to that point, like you said about challenging authority. It's not about challenging the authority, it's challenging the idea or the status quo or the challenge or the system to make it better or make progress. And I think, yeah, that's a really, really good point. Because often when we have healthy, challenging debate, people then start taking it personally because it feels like a personal attack. And it's not about the person, it's about the idea, the challenge, the system. Yeah.
Well, and I'm guessing you see that often, Claire, in the work that you're doing with teams, just the depersonalization. And it feels so important, maybe more important in this point of my life than ever before, as the differences between what people think and feel are so diverse. We've got to be clear about that. I'm not challenging who you are. I'm really interested in how you're thinking and being curious enough to be genuinely curious enough to ask some probing questions about that.
Yeah. It's so interesting because even like I'm reflecting on my learning edge from last week, and similar, scenarios happened when we were at our Harvard course, when we were creating the holding environment and the discomfort and disequilibrium that comes with that. And, you know, someone can make a comment meaning one thing and someone interprets it a very different way based on their background or their context or their experience or their beliefs. And there's obviously lots of different things that trigger different people, whether that's cultural, whether it's gender, whether it's, chronic pain or whatever's going on for that person inside. They might be going through some form of grief. And that's why I think it feels hard in the workplace at the moment to challenge people, because people do often take things personally based on what's going on for them. Is there anything that you recommend to help depersonalize things at KLC, or to help kind of take those things out of the system? Because I think on the one hand, if that's how someone's feeling, that's real to them and that's what's in the system. And at the
Mhm.
same time, sometimes we can create things in the system that might not really actually be there too. I know I'm sounding very cryptic.
No, I think I'm following you exactly. I think two things. I think one, um, shared language and being able to use a word. It's kind of like a safe word around here. Our folks will say, "Well, I want to offer a different interpretation,"
Mm,
um, which then means I'm thinking about it or looking at it differently,
mm,
but not because I disagree with you, just because I'm looking at it differently.
mm,
And that is depersonalizing. So I think one, shared language that is understood amongst people, particularly in teams that are working together, where there's enough time and energy and opportunity for folks to develop a shared language. The other thing I think is, kind of the opposite of safe spaces, but courageous spaces. And for folks to know that if I'm in a room and something is said that I find to be troubling or offensive, or then I've got to do two things. I've got to manage my trigger and figure out why I'm feeling the things that I'm feeling, what is happening to me. And then if I'm able to then in a quick moment identify that it's not just me, then it's my responsibility to educate other members of my team. Because again, if we have a collective purpose and we're winning together or losing together, it doesn't do me any good to not make sure. My job is to make sure you're at 10. And if I know something, you should know it. And if we've created a culture by which I'm sharing, hey, you know what? That's probably not the way we want to talk about that, because historically that's what these words have meant.
mm,
And it flusters me when I hear you say it. If I can say it that way, then I'm offering a gift to my colleague that's going to make them stronger, better, and help them to make progress. Because now we removed what could be a barrier for them connecting with other people. So I think it's got to be less about my feelings are hurt, and it's got to be more about, oh, that's a hole in our armor. And if I help you, ultimately you're going to help me too, and we're all going to be better off.
Yeah, and that feedback culture and sharing the impact on others and how things land, and rather than being what their intent was, like fully understanding what that looks like too.
Yeah.
I remember when we were at Harvard and we were talking about this concept of turning up the heat and trying to get people into the productive zone, out of the comfortable phase and not going too far into distress. And I remember us having a conversation about turning up the heat isn't about just poking the bear or anything like that, but it's, in your view, how can leaders effectively turn up the heat so we kind of stay in that productive learning zone?
Yeah. I think part of it is making sure that we're warm, right? Leadership starts with you and then you engage others. So am I showing up prepared? Am I energized by the issue that we have circled up? It's hard to raise heat on people when you're not bringing heat to the table.
Yeah.
So I think part is making sure that we're individually ready to show up and be solid contributors. I think the other thing is, I like to use data. I think data depersonalizes, and people can look at it from lots of different ways. You can get lots of different interpretations around whatever that data is, whether it's numbers or it's opinions or however you get some stuff in the room. And I think to challenge, again, those ideas. Once someone, like in Robert's Rules of Order, once you make a motion, the motion belongs to the group. Once you offer an intervention, it's no longer yours. Now we're working it as a group. When we're working it as a group, anyone can throw a log on the fire in order to get things up. We jokingly say that around here, we don't ever want it to be 72 degrees. Because it's 72 degrees, it's comfortable and everybody's chilling and it's a great staff meeting. We are really good about it, but we didn't do any real work.
Yeah.
Didn't do any real work.
72 degrees in Celsius to me is, whoa, that's hot. But you're obviously Fahrenheit. Yeah. It's an interesting one. Like, I was reflecting on my learning edge last week, and like I finished the first day of the Ali course, and I felt quite uncomfortable at times, and I had that feeling of like, why am I here? Like, why am I putting myself through this again? What am I doing? And then the second day, I got a lot of value out of it, but I really enjoyed it. And so then I was questioning, like, oh, was I supposed to be enjoying it? And I feel like my reflection after that was like not judging it. Like, learning comes in lots of different forms, and we will feel heat in different ways, but it doesn't mean that learning doesn't necessarily happen. But I do think that there's this misconception around, being comfortable, especially within a team, and that feels nice, and versus actually having a bit of discomfort. We know that we've got more psychological safety. We can have the tougher conversations. We're actually learning together. We're probably going into spaces we haven't been into before. And that's going to feel uncomfortable. Just really playing with that feeling, because it doesn't always feel the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That feels right. And the notion of psychological safety within a team, right? I've been watching some of your posts and how you're talking about it. I think it's critical. It's absolutely critical. It's hard for teams to work together and to create psychological safety if indeed I can't tell you that I don't feel safe. And if there's not a collective purpose, the first collective purpose of a team ought to be for us as a group of people coming together to move some work forward, that we're going to come out on the other side together, happy and whole. We're going to be the first goal.
Yeah, I completely agree. You mentioned about like offering different interpretations, and I think it's about valuing different perspectives and being able to hold them at the same time. Is there anything that you do with teams to help people appreciate or value different interpretations, different perspectives, so that they can actually then work out how they're going to intervene and what steps they're going to take?
Oftentimes we ask folks to publicly test their own interpretations. So we might say, let's get 10 interpretations on the table. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of work to come up with 10 different ways to think about a thing. And then if you offered it, then you get a chance to go back and test it and say, okay, well, after you've heard the other interpretations that have been made, what evidence do you have that shows that your interpretation may be the best one? Or conversely, is there evidence that would demonstrate that perhaps your interpretation is slightly off or maybe completely wrong? So we invite people not just to make interpretations, but to test them to see, why do I think that? Or where does that come from? How do I know that? Right? I am the queen of saying a thing. And then I'm like, I don't know why I thought I don't have any expertise. I don't have expertise there.
Yeah.
Why I think that's the truth. And so even when I just acknowledge, I don't know why I think I know a thing, it gives me permission to be wrong.
Yeah. And I think that comes back to the vulnerability, like being comfortable with not knowing and feeling safe to not know, especially when you might hold an authority position where people look to you for the direction or to always know what's next. And I think the reality is that we don't. Andrew Healy, who was at our course, he was in my group, and he sent me this great, I guess, metaphor for talking about multiple interpretations. I don't know if you've heard about the cone in the cube. Have you seen this? So it's a great picture of a cube, and inside it, there's a cone, like an upside down ice cream cone inside a cube. And group A looks through the top and group B looks through the side. And so group A can see a circle with a dot on the top and group B can see a triangle. And then they're arguing their points of view without being able to see other people's perspectives. And it's such a great analogy of how we can look at the same situation from different perspectives and see different things. And I absolutely loved it. So I'm actually going to use it with an executive team next week because I think it's such a great metaphor.
I think that's brilliant. I often use one that I learned during my undergrad. One of my professors said that she made the comment that history was like an accident at a four-way stop. When the police show up, what you report to the officer will be dependent upon the corner that you're standing on. What I see and experience from the southwest corner may be significantly different than what's reported from the northwest corner. Doesn't mean one of them is more or less true. In fact, both of them can be true. Until you get a 360 view of what happened, you don't really even have the entirety of the story. So I love Andrew's metaphor. I'm going to use that one too.
Yeah, I'll send you the article that he shared with me. So I want to jump back to accountability that we spoke about before, because I think in teams, when we're working through adaptive challenges, it can be hard to be concrete and tangible about what success looks like. And often people like to have that certainty, but with adaptive challenges, there's often not certainty. So how do we measure the success of teams operating under adaptive leadership principles, especially when outcomes are less predictable?
Yeah. I don't know that I've nailed that. One of the things that I try to do with the teams I'm working with is that we name success. And we kind of have a slogan around here that progress, not perfection. We're not going to get it right the first time. Our team isn't going to look right the first time. Every meeting we have isn't going to be a kumbaya experience. And we do what we can to try to measure that. When I think about, teams, particularly in culture, many of your organizations, I would imagine, are working on how do we get people aligned around cultural assets or things that we value within our system. Letting people identify whether or not we got close and offering back to the group after you've evaluated. I'm one to walk into a room and say, hey, here are the surveys that we took this year, 9 weeks or this quarter. Here's how people are feeling in our system. What are the interpretations of that? How do you think we all are doing? Oftentimes, as a person of authority, I get really anxious. I'm like, oh no, we got a 7 instead of 9. What does that mean? And then my team is like, well, a 7 is pretty good because this happened this quarter and this happened this quarter. And you remember the other thing? And I'm like, oh, well, in context, the 7's not so bad. But it's back to that shared accountability. If I, as the CEO, feel like I'm personally the only one responsible for our employee net promoter score or with holding cultural norms in our system, shame on me.
Yeah. I love that. Again, it's about giving the work back. It's about that shared and collective accountability, and everyone's has some skin in the game to contribute towards it. Because I also, lots of teams like to cascade down what measures of success or the goals. And I just think, well, it's far better for teams and individuals to work out how they can contribute towards what's happening from a holistic perspective rather than having that top-down approach. Yeah.
Well, I agree. We set some goals here. Now, I may, as the person responsible for the organization, I may set some goals. And then I offer it out and say, I need each one of you to tell me how you think your work drives this goal forward. I don't have to tell them. And in fact, most times what I find is people are excited about being able to say, well, my work drives strategy 1 forward in a significant way. And this is what we're doing. And this is why we need more resource to do it. Usually accompanies that. But then you get folks who are that in one way, that's how you build collective purpose. People understand that their work, while not the same as somebody else's, certainly aligns in order to move the needle on the thing that we're working on.
Yeah. So obviously you've got lots of, I guess, insight, delivering leadership development programs and the work that you actually provide at KLC, but you also lead a team yourself. So I'm curious, like, what do you see as the biggest challenges leaders face, whether it's the work that you do with leaders or leading a team yourself to build a thriving team?
I think personally, it's leading a team. We buy into the adaptive leadership strategies. We try to practice those behaviors, but we are human. And anytime you introduce a human element, there's a lot of things that come with that. I come from a space where a hierarchical upbringing from a career perspective. And so living and leading in an organization that uses less of that in order to move things forward. There are days when I want to come in and say, just do it because I said so. And that usually doesn't work. I usually stop short of doing that. I have enough, wherewithal to say, oh, what's a question I could ask, or how do I get people to move without dictating or mandating a thing? But I think the work of supporting a team is the hardest work that I'll do every day, is making sure that I am inspiring and energizing folks, that my interventions are meaningful. When I do use authority, I'm using it in a way that is helpful and not harmful, that folks have enough space to run and have autonomy and agency on the things that they need to have autonomy and agency over, so that I don't have overreach. I'm the queen of, I have a really good idea. And my people are like, we don't need meaning.
I think that often happens, especially at entrepreneurial companies where it's like the CEO or founder has this great idea and it's like, we've already got so many ideas. Let's say the global. Yeah.
No more. It's self-management of how I show up. And that, Claire, I think for people who are leaders of leaders, that can be the most stressful part. I spent a lot of time thinking about, did I say that right? Did I inspire collective vision? Man, did I get in the way? Did I show up well? I'm not always on. There are days when I show up and I'm 65% of the person I want to be. And in those cases, it's disappointing people. And it's really hard to feel like you've not given your folks what they need from you, or that you don't have what it is that they need in order to move forward. And I think so for folks who are leaders of leaders, that's the internal work that we get a chance to do. And when you were talking about your reflection of why do I do this to myself and why did I come back to this? I think that's the work of building internal leadership fortitude, is we keep coming back for same stuff.
Yeah. What I'm hearing though is there's a level of self-awareness and reflection required to lead. And also the fact that, although we might have felt like we've disappointed others, it's more about how do we not disappoint ourselves, but we're also human, and having that kind of lens that we're still human and we make mistakes just like anyone else does, because sometimes we can be our harshest judges as well. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that means you need really good friends and family to help your self-esteem intact.
Yeah, that support network around you. So what do you think are the key elements that build a thriving team? You probably touched on quite a few already, but What do you think?
Yeah, I think collective purpose, I would name first. I think to the degree it's possible, a shared nomenclature or language around how you're going to go about the work. And then I would offer naming success. And that's not necessarily a static thing. In phase one, success might look like this. In phase two, success might look different. And in many cases, in my experience, it has been. So I think being agile enough to change the definition, it doesn't change the work that you're doing, but it might either raise the heat or lower the heat on expectations. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. My final question for you is if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would it be?
Everybody needs one. And so our parents told us, or at least my mom told us, you can only have a friend if you can be a friend. I think you can only be on a thriving team if you're willing to contribute to what makes the team thrive. And so figuring out what your role is and how you help propel and make the other team members stronger. How much stronger would our teams be if my number one goal was to make sure that the other teammates that I have are better at what they do?
Oh, I love that.
Man,
Yeah. It would be an awesome team to be a part of.
want to be on that team.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kaye. I've absolutely loved our conversation today, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to see you, even though you're thousands of miles away.
I know. Hopefully we'll be in the same room again soon when you come to Oz. Yeah. All right. Take care.
You well.
What a powerful conversation with Kaye. One thing that really stayed with me was her reminder that thriving teams start with contribution. It's not just about being on a great team, it's about building one by lifting up others, making work visible, and creating space for courageous dialogue. Kaye's lens on adaptive leadership is such a gift. She helps us see that leadership isn't about having the answers, it's about creating the conditions for learning, alignment, and shared progress. I hope this episode sparks something fresh for you and your team. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Kaye's work and more leadership tools to support your journey. Until next time, keep thriving. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.